I sometimes think it would have been easier if my father had died in plain sight, on some heroic battlefield maybe, or in a submarine accident the whole country mourned. Instead, he vanished into secrecy, swallowed by a classified mission from which he never returned. That's the fate I've been chasing ever since. A ghost, a father I hardly knew, a life full of half-told stories and locked archives. People say obsession is the slowest form of ending yourself, and maybe they're right. But that's how, at 19, I found myself on a snow-packed truck headed into Siberia, to a frigid outpost on the shore of a lake no map would ever show. I am, or was, junior diving specialist Lev Konstantinovich Shevchenko, Soviet Navy, Arctic Research Division. Quite a mouthful, I know, but only the official title. Unofficially, I was the scrawny kid who kept fiddling with his father's old diving knife as if some paternal spirit still lingered in the dull blade. It was the winter of 1982, and I'd been posted to a secretive dive station near a stretch of Siberian water known locally, when it was acknowledged at all, as Lake Yezheritsk. The official paperwork called it Region A13, or sometimes Baikal Subsector. In hushed rumor, people said the lake was connected to the deeper recesses of Lake Baikal itself through labyrinthine underwater caverns. Nobody seemed in a hurry to confirm or deny. We arrived at the station around dusk, which in those parts felt like midnight. The wind bit so hard that I couldn't decide if my face or my pride hurt worse. I disembarked from the vehicle with numb limbs, glancing around to see if any friendly soul would greet me with hot tea and warm conversation. No such luck. What I did see was a short, thick-set officer trudging toward me in a heavy coat, the swirling snow giving him a ghostly halo. His face was an ice sculpture of disdain. "Name?" he asked, not so much greeting me as verifying that I existed. "Junior diving specialist Lev Konstantinovich Shevchenko," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. He grunted. "Captain Voronin, I run this station. Don't slow me down." He turned, and I trudged after him through a metal door that led inside. The warmth hit me, along with an odor of stale coffee, diesel fumes, and fear. The trifecta of survival in a place so isolated that even the crows refused to visit. I spotted a flickering overhead light that illuminated a battered corkboard near a canteen entrance. On it hung a single sheet of paper with large typed text. 1. Never dive alone at dawn. 2. Don't speak to figures on the ice. 3. Stray whispers in the water must be ignored. 4. Ice doors are sealed for a reason. 5. Never surface with frostbite on both hands. 6. Scrape the ice from your mask as soon as you surface. 7. The final rule. Our mission always comes first. They weren't titled official rules or anything, just listed out in plain, serious black text. No comedic disclaimers, no clarifications, no mention of punishments or rewards. Just words waiting to be obeyed. A tall, lean diver walked by, wearing a uniform that had seen better days. He noticed me gawking at the board and let out a humorless chuckle. "Take them seriously," he said. "They keep men alive." Then he was gone. I was left wondering how a grown man could read an ominous set of instructions like that with the same calmness one might reserve for a grocery list. But I'd soon learn there was nothing calm about those rules at all. The dorm they stuck me in smelled like 3 decades of men's sweat baked into the walls, mixed with something sharp and metallic, like pennies left in the sun. I tossed my duffel onto the mattress and the springs didn't just squeak. They wailed like they were being tortured. The sound pinged off concrete walls painted the exact shade of green you'd find on moldy bread. A guy with a neck as thick as my thigh appeared in the doorway, filling it completely. His nose had been broken at least twice, and scar tissue puckered his left eyebrow. But his eyes crinkled at the corners, surprising me. Would you look at that? They sent me another baby-faced one," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "Mikhail Kozlov, from Rostov. Most people call me Misha." He thrust out a hand dotted with tiny burn scars and calluses hard as wood. I shook it, noticing the strength he deliberately held back. Lev. Good, he laughed, throwing himself onto the opposite bunk that protested with a metallic screech. Last guy they sent me snored like a goddamn tugboat. Could hear him through my pillow. So, first time in Satan's icebox? He grinned, revealing a chipped front tooth that somehow made his weathered face more human than all the perfect teeth back at the Naval Academy. Something in his easy manner made the knot in my stomach loosen a bit. We chatted for hours, Misha telling stories about his mother's cooking. Borscht so good you'd slap your grandmother for a second bowl, while I found myself describing the fishing boats in my village, how they'd come in at dawn trailing seagulls like white flags. Neither of us mentioned why we were really here. Come on, he said finally, slapping his knees. Better show you around before you wander off and freeze your dick to a door handle. He led me through corridors so twisty I got lost after the third turn. The concrete walls were slick with condensation that froze in runnels along the floor. Overhead pipes knocked and hissed like they were alive. Mess hall. Food's crap, but it's hot. Storage. Don't take anything without logging it or Petrolov will have your balls. Officers' quarters. Stay the fuck away unless you're summoned. Misha pointed to each door we passed. A massive steel hatch loomed ahead, its edges crusted with rust. The hazard stripes around it faded to dirty yellow. What about that one? I asked. Misha's voice dropped so low I had to lean in. His breath smelled of cigarettes and the peculiar tinny tea they served here. Old section. Built when Stalin was still warm in his grave. Nobody goes in there unless... He made a slicing gesture across his throat. Weird stuff happens behind those doors. What kind of weird? The words died in my throat. Down at the corridor's end, partly hidden by shadow, stood someone watching us. Tall, still as a statue. The single overhead bulb blinked once, plunging us into darkness for a heartbeat. When light returned, the figure was gone. My mouth went dry. Did you see? Misha's face closed like a fist. Nope. And neither did you, he muttered, eyes darting to the corners of the ceiling. Captain's got little rats everywhere. Let's go. I lay awake that night listening to Misha's soft snores. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed of my father, not the stern man who'd left for his special assignment and never returned, but a skeletal figure trapped behind glass, clawing to get out, mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear. I jerked awake, drenched in cold sweat, my heart smashing against my ribs. A bell rang at 0500, rusty and harsh as a crow's call. I stumbled to the ops room, still tasting sleep in my mouth like copper pennies. Captain Voronin stood with his legs spread and arms folded, jaw rigid. His eyes scanned me like targeting lasers. Shevchenko, he snapped. You're with Petrov. Valve inspection. He turned to the man beside him. Try to bring this one back. The big man who stepped forward looked like he'd been carved from the Siberian permafrost itself. Gray beard streaked with white, cheeks webbed with broken capillaries, and a slight limp when he walked. The scar above his left eyebrow still looked angry, puckered and red, but it was his eyes that got me. Flat and watchful, like a wolf who'd decided not to eat you. Yet, Oleg, he said simply, jerking his chin toward the corridor. Gear room. Now. The equipment storage stank of diesel, machine oil, rubber, and the sweat of scared men who'd worn these suits before us. I struggled into my gear while Oleg watched me with the flat disinterest of someone who'd seen too many rookies come and go. How much cold water experience? He asked, voice like boots crunching on broken glass. Barents Sea, I said, trying not to betray how my heart was already hammering. 2 years. Oleg hawked and spat on the floor. Barents' bathtub compared to here. Water under this ice? It'll freeze your piss before it leaves your cock. He thumped my air regulator hard. Stay tight on me. Signal only. No talking unless absolutely necessary. His eyes narrowed to blue slits. They hear you down there. They? Orders. He corrected too quickly. Command hears everything. Keep comms protocol. Understand? My mouth felt suddenly dry. I nodded, thinking about those posted rules I'd glimpsed yesterday. The dive platform was an ancient steel cage with bolts the size of my fist. The metal was so cold it stuck to my gloved hand when I touched the railing. As we descended, the platform shuddered and groaned like something dying. Freezing air gave way to water that hit like a physical blow. Not just cold, but aggressively so, as if it wanted to hurt you. Darkness swallowed us. Not the darkness of night, but something thicker, something hungry. Oleg flicked on his light, cutting a pale tunnel through black water dense with ice particles that swirled like tiny ghosts. I could barely see 6 feet ahead. My suit, supposedly designed for these conditions, felt paper thin. The cold probed every seam, hunting for weakness, slithering against my skin. We swam along a massive pipeline crusted with ice, Oleg checking gauges with methodical precision. My job was simple: illuminate and assist. I swept my beam upward to the ice ceiling that capped us in this liquid grave. And that's when I saw it. Pressed against the underside of the ice, a figure, human-shaped but wrong, too elongated, limbs stretched like taffy, fingers too numerous and thin. It didn't move, didn't need to. It watched us through holes where eyes should be. My throat closed up. Rule number 2, don't speak to figures on the ice. But it wasn't on the ice. It was under it, like us. And the rule specified not speaking to them, not about them. Right? Oleg, I croaked into my comm. There's something. A wall of static hit my ears, so loud and sudden I nearly lost my regulator. My oxygen gauge, which had been steady green, suddenly flashed amber, then red. The needle dropped like a stone. I spun, panicking, and froze. The figure, now closer, though I hadn't seen it move, hung just at the edge of my light's reach. Skeletal, with skin like translucent paper stretched over bones. I couldn't breathe. My lungs heaved, finding nothing. Oleg's hand clamped around my arm like a vice. He yanked me upward with such force my shoulder nearly popped. We kicked hard for the surface as my vision tunneled, black spots clustering. Pressure drop, Oleg bellowed as we broke the surface. Emergency extract. Hands grabbed me, hauling me onto the platform. Someone ripped my mask off and I saw it. Ice formed on the inside of the visor in the unmistakable shape of a gaunt face, hollow-eyed, jaw stretched too wide. Not my face. Its face. Rule number 6. Scrape the ice from your mask as soon as you surface. My fingers shook so badly I could barely do it. The ice chunk came away with a crack, shattering on the deck. In the fragments, just for a heartbeat, those same hollow eyes stared back at me. They dragged me to medical, where a doctor skinny as a surgical instrument strapped sensors to my chest with tobacco-stained fingers. Novikov, they called him. He listened to my lungs with an expression of profound boredom. Minor oxygen deprivation, he said, scribbling on a clipboard. Panic response. Common in new divers. I almost laughed in his face. Panic response? I'd seen something watching us, something that had nearly killed me by draining my air supply. But the words locked in my throat. Mikhail barged in an hour later, worry etched into the lines of his face. Gosh, kid, he said, dropping onto the edge of my cot. First dive and you already try to drown yourself? That's got to be some kind of record. I glanced around to make sure we were alone. Misha, I saw something down there, under the ice. It watched us, and then my oxygen just disappeared. Instead of the disbelief I'd expected, Mikhail's face went slack with recognition. He leaned in so close I could count the broken blood vessels in his nose. Stuzhevic, he whispered, the word fogging in the chilled air between us. The cold men. Old divers talk about them when the officers aren't around. His eyes darted to the door. They live under the ice, can't be photographed, can't be recorded. And they take people. Before I could ask more, the infirmary door banged open. Captain Voronin strode in, jaw muscles working like he was grinding glass between his teeth. Mikhail straightened so fast his spine cracked. "Out!" Voronin snapped, and Mikhail was gone like he'd never been there. The captain loomed over me, his shadow falling across my face. Up close, I could see the network of red veins in his eyes, the white scar tissue at his throat like something had once tried to tear out his jugular. "Impressive, Shevchenko," he said, voice flat as a frozen lake. "One dive and you nearly screwed up the entire operation." "Sir, there was something down there. My oxygen was checked before and after. Nothing wrong with it." His breath smelled like cigarettes and something else. Vodka, maybe. "If you can't handle the conditions here, there are other ways to serve the state. Less comfortable ways. Understand?" He stared down at me, waiting. I knew what he wanted to hear. "Yes, sir. Won't happen again." "Good." He turned to leave, then paused. "The final rule, Shevchenko. Our mission always comes first, even before your life. Remember that." That night, the wind screamed outside like it was being tortured. Cracks in the window frame let in air so cold it burned my skin. Mikhail hunched on his bunk, scribbling furiously in a notebook, the scratch of his pen keeping time with my racing thoughts. "What are you writing?" I asked finally. He grinned over his shoulder, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My masterpiece. Frozen balls. A Soviet diver's tale." He flipped the notebook shut. "Gonna make me famous someday, this will." "You should be careful," I said, eyeing the ventilation grate above his bunk. "Someone might not appreciate your literary talents." His smile faded a fraction. "Oh, they're definitely listening. That's half the fun." For the next 3 days, I fell into the station's routine like a body into a grave. Wake up freezing, eat gray porridge, dive in killing cold. Try not to think about what lurked just beyond our lights. Scrub equipment. Eat mystery meat. Sleep with one eye open. Mikhail was the only thing keeping me sane. Between shifts, we'd play cards with a deck so worn the kings and queens were featureless smudges. He'd tell stories, some funny, some dark, as the water we worked in. "You know the D-Wing?" he said one night, voice low. "The section that's been sealed since '64. There was a whole research team there, 20 men. Then one morning, poof, all gone. Official report says resigned. But Vasily in communications, his uncle was stationed here then, says they broke through to some kind of cave system under the ice." His eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Next day, entirely new crew. No explanation. You think it has something to do with the Stuzhevic?" Mikhail shuffled the cards, the soft whir filling the silence. "I think there's a reason you won't find this lake on any map, Lavochka. Not even the classified ones." I was tightening valves in Sector 3 the next day when the shouting started. Men running past, voices urgent but hushed. I followed the commotion to the mechanical workshop. A crowd had gathered, their backs to me. When I pushed through, my heart stopped. Mikhail lay sprawled on the concrete like a broken puppet. His eyes stared at nothing, glazed and empty. Around his throat, a bruise had blossomed. Deep purple-black, fingers clearly visible in the pattern. A trickle of blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, rust-colored against his gray skin. "No," I heard myself say, the word strangled. "No, no, no." Someone murmured. "Found him by the sealed door. Must have been snooping." Another voice. Throat crushed. "Who could have?" Lieutenant Baranov shouldered through the crowd, face impassive as a stone idol. "Clear the area," he ordered. "Back to your stations." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mikhail, my friend, the only person who'd shown me kindness in this frozen hell, was dead. Murdered. "Sir," I said, my voice cracking. "This is a crime scene. We need to investigate." Baranov's eyes locked onto mine, cold as the lake bottom. I said, "Clear the area, specialist. That's an order." Before I could argue, 2 guards muscled past me. They zipped Mikhail into a black bag, not gently. Not like he was a person who'd laughed and told stories and written secret poems, like he was garbage to be disposed of. My legs went numb. I sagged against the wall, watching them cart away the body. Through the dispersing crowd, I caught a glimpse of Voronin watching from the shadows, his face utterly expressionless. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned and walked away, boot heels clicking on concrete. That night, rage and grief took turns punching holes in my gut. The empty bunk across from me seemed to scream with silence. I kept seeing Mikhail's face, not cold and still as I'd found him, but alive, laughing, telling me about his mother's borscht that could make angels weep. Why? What had he discovered? The bruise pattern around his neck had been distinctive. Not fingers exactly, but something longer, thinner. When I closed my eyes, I saw that figure under the ice, its impossible limbs reaching. Sleep had just dragged me under when the whispers started. A knot of men in the corridor, passing news. Ivan, a new diver, had gone out alone at dawn. Breaking rule number 1. He hadn't come back, just vanished. Someone claimed they'd heard screaming over the comms. A voice begging, then nothing. The official announcement the next morning. Accidental drowning. Equipment failure. No body recovered. No search mounted. Just another name erased as if he'd never existed. I stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mikhail's bruised throat, heard Ivan's phantom screams, the image of my father, trapped behind ice, clawing to get out. 3 nights after Mikhail's death, I snuck into the small closet they called a library. Dusty technical manuals, faded logbooks. I pulled them out frantically, scanning for any mention of the Stujevik, the sealed doors, my father's mission. You're digging your own grave, Shevchenko. I whirled around, heart slamming. Senior Lieutenant Berkutov stood in the doorway, tall, lean, with crow's feet etched deep around intelligent eyes. I'd seen him with the captain, but we'd never spoken. My hand closed around a screwdriver I'd shoved in my pocket earlier. What do you want? He stepped inside, shutting the door with a soft click. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I knew your father. My grip tightened on the screwdriver, knuckles whitening. Bullcrap. Konstantin Ivanovich, brilliant diver, specialized in extreme condition exploration. Berkutov's eyes never left mine. Disappeared during a classified mission in '75. They told your mother it was an equipment failure. It wasn't. The breath rushed from my lungs. How do you... He reached inside his jacket. I tensed, but he pulled out only a thin manila folder, edges frayed. Because I've seen too much. Like your friend Mikhail. Like that boy Ivan. His voice dropped further. The Stujevik are real. They've been here longer than we have. And command knows. My mouth went dry as sand. Knows what? That they're killing us. That they've always killed us. But the upper brass wants data, research, results. Even if it costs lives. He flipped open the folder, revealing grainy photos of elongated shapes half hidden in blizzards. Even if it cost someone like Mikhail. Rage boiled up my throat. They killed him. Someone did, Berkutov acknowledged grimly. Because he found something about the sealed areas. The doors, where do they lead? He wet his lips, eyes darting to the ventilation grate. When they built this station after the war, they discovered natural caverns under the lake. They sent exploration teams. Found things. Conducted experiments. His finger tapped a note scrawled in faded pencil. When it all went wrong, they sealed it up and pretended it never happened. I stared at the images, remembering the gaunt figure under the ice. In the margin, someone had written, "Feeds on warmth, breath, drains oxygen. Cannot be photographed directly. Images distort or degrade." My own oxygen tank, needle dropping to 0 as that thing watched me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why risk it?" Berkutov's face hardened. Because I had a brother here once, like you had Mikhail, like you had a father. He gathered the papers, tucking them away. Whatever you're planning, and I see it in your eyes, be careful. The Watchers aren't the only predators in these halls. He slipped out, silent as shadow, leaving me with questions that cut like ice shards against my skin. I went through the next week in a daze, going through motions like a wind-up toy soldier. Every dive with Oleg felt like Russian roulette. No more face-to-face encounters with the Watchers, but they made themselves known. A flash of white in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned my head. A sudden temperature drop as we passed certain sections of pipe. The sound of something scraping against ice overhead when nothing was there. My oxygen gauge still showed those impossible drops, 25% to 15% in seconds. But I'd kick for the surface the moment the needle twitched. Every time we broke water, I'd scrape my mask with shaking fingers, digging my nails into the crusted ice that always formed in the same twisted pattern. 2 sunken hollows for eyes, a stretched gap where a mouth should be. Once the ice chunks hit the deck, I swear to God one of them hissed as it melted. Zykov, a deckhand with 30 years' experience, crossed himself when he saw it, muttering Chernobog under his breath. The black god from old Slavic myths, lord of darkness and death. Stumbling back to my quarters after a double shift, I noticed something carved into a maintenance panel with what must have been a knife point, the scratches still bright against the dull metal. The cold men are here. Not graffiti, a warning gouged with desperate force by fingers that pressed so hard they left rust-colored smears at the edges. Blood. Guards now patrolled Sector 5 in rotating pairs, carrying AK-47s instead of standard-issue sidearms. Their eyes darted everywhere, fingers twitching on triggers. The older technicians whispered about 4 researchers who'd broken into the sealed section in 71. They came back wrong, muttering about the congregation beneath for 3 days straight before slitting their wrists with broken light bulbs. The wet gurgle of their laughter still echoed in the old air ducts, some said. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake counting drips from the ceiling pipe, 3,462 one night, until my eyes burned like I'd poured acid in them. When exhaustion finally knocked me unconscious, the nightmares came. That thing under the ice, now 12 feet tall with fingers like icicles, peeling Mikhail's face off while he screamed. My father reaching through frost-covered glass, mouth moving around words I couldn't quite hear except for run, and too late. I woke most nights with my sheets soaked through, teeth chattering so hard I tasted blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Misha's death didn't just break something in me, it cracked open a dam. Suddenly, men who'd never looked me in the eye were finding ways to talk. Oleg sliding his cigarette pack to me with a folded note inside. Semyon, a bone-thin radio operator whose brother had transferred last winter. Thick-necked Kirill with hands like hammers who'd seen Ivan's helmet camera footage before it mysteriously erased itself. Even Berkutov started lingering after inspections, his clipped official tone dissolving when no one else was around. Disgust twisting his mouth when he mentioned command's containment protocols. We'd meet where we wouldn't be overheard, behind the boiler that screamed like a banshee, drowning any conversation. In the abandoned storage locker B-17 where someone had sabotaged the surveillance mic. In the generator building's shadow during fuel deliveries, when the roar of the pumps covered anything. The 4 of us hunched together like conspirators, which I guess we were. I spread out Berkutov's photos on an upturned crate. The Watchers, the sealed doors, the partial map of tunnels leading into the lake bed. Oleg stared at them, tobacco-stained fingers tracing the outline of something elongated and barely visible in the corner of a frame. Had a buddy Anatoly back in 76, he said, voice rougher than usual. Found him frozen solid in his bunk. Middle of summer, heat working fine. His goddamn eyeballs had ice crystals in them. He tapped the grainy silhouette in the photo. These damn things are getting bolder. 20 years I've been at this station. Used to be you'd maybe see one, once a year. Now? He just shook his head, the skin around his eyes tight and bloodless. Kirill spat on the concrete floor. We just gonna wait for them to take us one by one? Ivan was my bunkmate. Know what he sounded like on the comm before it cut out? Like his throat was full of ice water. Kept saying they're so beautiful over and over. Mikhail found something, I said, the words scraping my throat. Something in those sealed sections. That's why they killed him. Semyon hadn't said a word the whole meeting. Now he looked up, his thin face all sharp angles in the weak light. My brother Nikolai, before he disappeared, he told me about the caves under the station. His voice trembled, hands clutching each other white-knuckle tight. Said the original construction team broke through to something. A cathedral of ice, he called it, with pillars that moved when you weren't looking directly at them. Silence fell like a shroud. I could hear each man's breathing, Oleg's wheezing rasp, Kirill's bull-like snorts, Semyon's shallow gasps. We have to see what's behind those doors, I said finally. Whatever Mikhail found, whatever got him killed, it's down there. 4 men against the Watchers, against command. Kirill snorted, but his eyes showed naked fear. Might as well slit our throats now, save everyone the trouble. Not just 4. Berkutov appeared in the doorway like a ghost, making Semyon jump so hard he knocked over the crate. I'm in. I can override the security lockouts. Disable the alarms on the southwest quadrant for 17 minutes. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, an old technical diagram of Sector 5. 3 nights from now, 0200 hours. Maintenance blackout is scheduled. Skeleton crew only. His eyes met mine, hollow with something beyond fear. But understand this. If something goes wrong, if you're caught, I was never here. And if Voronin gets even a whisper of this plan... What? Kirill demanded. Berkutov's face contorted, lips pulling back from his teeth. Did you know we had a technical specialist last year who got drunk, started asking questions about the Watchers in the mess hall? Following morning, they found him inside his own locker. Hole drilled in his skull. Clean. Surgical. Command said suicide. The words hit like a physical punch. We weren't just planning to face whatever lurked beneath the ice. We were going against our own people, men who'd murder to keep their secrets. But Misha's face, his eyes staring at nothing, that bruise around his throat, burned brighter in my mind than any fear. 3 nights, I agreed. 0200 hours. We'd break into the sealed section, find what Mikhail died for, maybe discover some weapon against the Watchers. Maybe just die in the attempt, but at least we'd die knowing. We picked Tuesday night, payday for the guards, when half of them would be either drunk off their asses or sleeping it off. Berkutov would trigger an electrical short in junction box 17, sending the night patrol scrambling to the opposite end of the station. Semyon, with his pianist fingers and lock-picking skills learned in Moscow juvenile detention, would crack the mechanical locks. Kirill, built like a tractor with hands to match, would handle any stubborn doors. I'd lead the dive because I couldn't ask the others to go first into that nightmare. Oleg just grunted when we assigned roles, finally muttering, "Someone's got to make sure you stupid fucks don't drown yourselves." We stole our supplies piece by piece, an oxygen canister from the emergency station in C Wing where inventory was always sloppy, regulator valves from the maintenance shed during smoke breaks, dive lights with batteries fresh off the supply helicopter. Oleg ripped open his old suit and lined it with aluminum sheeting stolen from the kitchen, the metal crinking as he moved. Grandma had dementia, he explained, threading stolen fishing line through the rubber. Wrapped herself in foil to keep the KGB from reading her thoughts. But these things, they smell heat like sharks smell blood. I'd started keeping a tape recorder in my suit pocket against my better judgment. Rule number 3 kept screaming in my head. Stray whispers in the water must be ignored. But those whispers had morphed into something more. Wet, gurgling voices calling my name in the darkness. Once, horrifyingly, in what sounded like Mikhail's voice, though his body had already been shipped out in a zinc coffin. Even creepier, a child's voice singing a lullaby my father used to hum, one I hadn't heard since I was 7. I didn't sleep a wink Monday night, just stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a man screaming while counting every heartbeat jackhammering against my ribs. 4,617 by dawn. I kept running my thumb over the nick in my father's diving knife, where he'd once pried open an oyster to show me the pearl inside. Half of me wanted to stuff my meager belongings in my duffel and make a break for the supply truck scheduled at 0600. The other half knew I'd never outrun the questions that haunted me, or the watchers that had already marked me as theirs. Tuesday brought the worst blizzard in months. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed like women being murdered, fingernails of ice scraping down the metal hull of the station. We met in storage locker 22B, a closet-sized space crammed with broken pump parts and rat-chewed maintenance manuals. A single bare bulb with a cracked glass cover cast everything in sickly yellow. When I looked at our shadows stretching up the walls, I swear to God, they didn't match our bodies. Too tall, too thin, arms too long. Berkutov arrived last, snow crusting his eyelashes like cataracts, hands shaking as he passed out the hand-drawn maps. Junction Box 17 will short at exactly 0100. Night Patrol will scramble. You've got 12 minutes before backup generators kick in. His pupils were pinpoints, even in the dim light. If you're caught, I was never here. He patted his service pistol meaningfully. The minute hand on my father's watch ticked to 0100, and right on cue. Half the lights in the station died with a sound like a giant taking its last breath. We moved like thieves, boots wrapped in rags to muffle our steps, breath held till our lungs burned. Guard Petrovich, famous for his vodka habits and blinding headaches, was slumped at his post outside Sector 5, snoring wetly, a half-empty bottle tucked beside his chair. We slid past him like ghosts, watching his breath fog in the sub-zero air. The infamous door loomed before us, 2.3 meters of rusted Soviet steel with warning signs plastered across it like postage stamps on a forgotten letter. The Cyrillic stenciling had faded to the color of dried blood. Below it, someone had carved by hand, "Death awaits you." Kirill wedged his crowbar into the frame, not steel but titanium, stolen from deep-sea submersible parts, and heaved. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the corridor, making my back teeth vibrate. The smell that gusted out hit us like a physical blow. The rotten egg stench of ancient standing water mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the open grave smell when they exhumed my uncle after floodwaters rose in the village cemetery. We slipped inside and pulled the door closed behind us, the click of the latch like a period at the end of a suicide note. Our flashlight beams cut yellow tunnels through darkness thick as oil. The ceiling hung so low I had to stoop, concrete sweating moisture that dripped down my neck and froze instantly against my skin. Frost patterns covered every surface, not random but intricate, deliberate. Swirls and jagged lines that almost formed writing in a language no human throat could pronounce. Jesus, Oleg whispered, his breath crystallizing instantly. It's colder than a witch's tit in January. -40 at least, Semyon added, the words chattering between teeth that wouldn't stop clicking together. We followed a narrow passage that spiraled downward, each step taking us deeper beneath the lake ice. The metal staircase had corroded so badly that twice my boot punched straight through a step, sending me lurching forward with my heart in my throat. The further we descended, the more the walls changed. Not concrete anymore, but something that looked like black volcanic glass shot through with white veins. I touched one wall. It felt slick, almost oily, and vibrated faintly beneath my fingertips like something alive. At the bottom, we faced another door, this one 3 times thicker than the first, with massive hinges that had gone green with verdigris. A padlock the size of my fist secured a chain thick enough to anchor a battleship, wrapped around industrial handles. Soviet security at its finest, muttered Kirill, positioning his bolt cutters. Built to last 1,000 years, defeated by a 50-ruble tool. The chain parted with a sound like bones breaking. The metal of the door burned cold against my bare hand. Not just freezing, but actively, aggressively cold, like it was sucking heat directly from my flesh. When I pulled away, a layer of skin stayed behind, frozen to the handle. "Fuck," I hissed, stuffing my bleeding palm against my mouth. "Let me." Kirill shouldered me aside, using his gloved hands to heave the door open. The chamber beyond made my bladder threaten to let go. A vast underground dock stretched into darkness, clearly man-made at first. Concrete pillars, rusted gantries, metal catwalks, but transitioning into something else. The concrete floor just stopped about 20 meters in, giving way to what looked like natural stone that sloped down into inky water. Massive icicles hung from the ceiling like the teeth of a leviathan, some as thick as my torso. The water itself was flat black and perfectly still, not even a ripple, as if it weren't liquid at all but solid obsidian. "The gate," croaked Oleg, pointing to a rusted mechanism bolted to the wall, "should open to the main lake." He yanked the lever, muscles straining, but it moved only a few centimeters before something inside snapped with a sound like a gunshot. "Freaking Soviet engineering," he spat, kicking it. "Always breaks when you need it most." We ended up forcing the emergency maintenance access, a half-meter gap in the channel that barely let water trickle through. It widened enough with all four of us pulling that black water began oozing in, so viscous it seemed to crawl rather than flow, glistening under our lights like wet tar. We zipped into our modified suits, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to secure each clasp. The rubber felt thin as paper against the killing cold waiting for us. I forced myself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to puke as adrenaline turned my stomach inside out. "Quick recon," I reminded them, checking my father's knife was secure at my hip. 10 minutes max. Signal at the first sign of trouble. Semyon crossed himself, muttering what sounded like a prayer. "Probably praying to the wrong god down here," Kirill snorted, but his voice wavered. One by one, we slipped into the black water. The cold hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. The temperature gauge on my wrist dropped so fast the needle bent. -62°C, colder than any water should possibly remain liquid. My light cut maybe 2 meters ahead before the darkness swallowed it. The beam illuminated particulate matter suspended in the water. Not silt or algae, but tiny crystalline structures that sometimes caught the light and flashed with impossible colors I couldn't name. We moved in formation, following the stone tunnel as it curved deeper beneath the station. My ears popped painfully as pressure increased. The comms crackled with nothing but our breathing. Oleg's raspy wheeze, Semyon's quick shallow pants, my own measured inhale-exhale. Then I saw it. Movement at the edge of my beam. Not fish, not human. Something pale and elongated, gliding just beyond where my light could clearly define it. "Kirill," I whispered, forgetting protocol. 2 o'clock. "Do you see?" "I see it," his voice cracked. "The wall. Oh shit." I swung my beam toward the stone face to our right. The light caught them. 3, no, 5 figures pressed against the rock like leeches. Their bodies were skeleton thin, ribs visible beneath translucent skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Arms and legs stretched too long, joints bending at impossible angles. And their heads, oh God, hairless and elongated with no ears, no nose, just hollow sockets where eyes should be and thin lipless slits for mouths. I've seen men pause in combat situations, stand frozen in the face of certain death. It's a normal physiological response. But we all moved, almost in unison, pointing our lights at these things that couldn't possibly exist. The watchers didn't react to our beams. They clung motionless to the stone, like specimens pinned to a board. But somehow, God help me, I knew they saw us, felt us. I could physically feel their attention, like icy fingers probing inside my skull, behind my eyes, down my throat. My training kicked in. I signaled the others. Maintain formation, proceed with caution. We edged forward, keeping to the opposite wall, lights trained on the watchers. Then the water changed, vibrated. A low-frequency moan rolled through the liquid, more felt than heard, like the bass at a concert that rattles your ribcage. It modulated, twisting into something almost linguistic. Shevchenko. My name stretched across frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce, spoken by something that had never been human. I nearly swallowed my regulator. The watchers moved then, detaching from the wall in perfect synchronization, drifting toward us with the deliberate grace of predators who know their prey can't escape. Screw this! Kirill's panic burst through the calm. He spun, kicking hard to retreat. No, keep formation, I shouted, but too late. One watcher, 9 feet tall at least, shot forward with the speed of a striking snake. Its impossible fingers clamped onto Kirill's tank. I watched in horror as the oxygen gauge on Kirill's wrist display plummeted from green to red in 2 seconds flat. His body convulsed, back arching unnaturally. A cloud of bubbles erupted around him. Then he was gone. Not dead, not floating, just gone, like he'd never existed. Only his tether remained, drifting aimlessly where a human had been moments before. "Kirill!" Semyon screamed, lunging toward the spot. I grabbed his arm with enough force to bruise. One death was enough. "Retreat!" Oleg bellowed through the calm. We kicked desperately toward the dock, my thighs burning with the effort. The watchers pursued, closing the gap with each stroke. We reached the entrance, just 3 more meters to the platform, when the overhead hatch slammed down with a metallic boom that pulsed through the water. Someone had sealed us in. My oxygen alarm shrieked, the needle dropping into the red zone though I'd used less than a quarter tank. The watchers drew closer, their blank eye sockets somehow hungry. I hammered my fist against the hatch, the dull thud swallowed by water and metal. "There!" Semyon's voice pitched high with terror. He pointed to a gap in the chamber wall, a narrow drainage tunnel half submerged. We swam for it, blind panic driving us forward. My lungs burned like I'd swallowed fire, black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. I could feel the cold radiating from the nearest watcher, just inches from my flailing legs. The tunnel sloped upward, eventually breaking the water's surface. We dragged ourselves onto a narrow ledge, Semyon retching lake water, Oleg wheezing like each breath might be his last. My hands shook so badly I could barely work the latch on my helmet. We'd emerged in some kind of maintenance access. Concrete walls covered in Soviet-era warning signs, a rusted ladder leading upward. Behind us, the water remained unnaturally still. 3 white faces watched from just below the surface, unmoving, unblinking. "Why aren't they following?" Semyon gasped between retches. "Don't know," Oleg panted, face gray as cigarette ash. "Don't really care." We staggered to the ladder, every muscle screaming in protest. The hatch at the top was frozen shut, not just stuck, but sealed with a layer of ice an inch thick from the inside. It took both me and Oleg hammering with dive knives to break through. We tumbled onto a metal catwalk in what looked like an abandoned section of the station. Dust-covered control panels, empty chair bolted to the floor, a coffee mug still sitting on a desk as if its owner had just stepped away. A calendar on the wall showed March 1968. We got out, Semyon wheezed, tears cutting trails through the grime on his face. "But Kirill is dead," Oleg cut him off. "And so are we if they catch us here." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight on my chest. We'd escaped the watchers only to face a different monster, our own command structure, willing to seal a hatch on 3 men to keep whatever secrets lurked beneath the ice. We sloshed through forgotten tunnels, our boots squelching in 3 inches of black water that stank like a mixture of diesel fuel and rotting seaweed. My left hip throbbed where I'd slammed it into a valve wheel. Semyon's lips had turned the color of a week-old bruise, and Oleg wheezed like his lungs were filling with fluid. Yellow-brown water stains mapped continents on concrete walls where Soviet propaganda posters peeled away. "Science conquers all," screamed one, showing a heroic diver planting a red flag on the ocean floor. Some conquest that was. A scraping noise echoed behind us, metal against metal, followed by a wet, slithering sound that made the hairs on my neck stand up like nails. Something was working at the hatch we'd sealed, its patience mechanical and terrible. "Move your asses," Oleg hissed, shoving Semyon forward so hard he stumbled. "Whatever's back there isn't filling out paperwork to follow us." We found ourselves in what must have been Equipment Bay 12, according to the faded numbering stenciled on rusted locker doors. Puddles of frozen condensation crunched under our boots. Semyon's flashlight beam bounced across gutted machinery cabinets with their wires hanging out like colorful intestines. Oleg kicked at a dented canister, sending it clattering across the floor. "What the hell is all this?" I started, turning to follow Oleg's light. The words died in my throat. Kirill sat propped against the far wall like a discarded mannequin, eyes staring at nothing, mouth stretched in a scream that would never make sound again. His diving suit had been peeled open from neck to navel, not torn but precisely separated along the seams. "No way," I breathed, bile rising so fast I had to swallow it back. We just saw him." "Don't," Oleg warned, but I was already stumbling forward, drawn by the same sick fascination that makes people slow down at car wrecks. Up close, Kirill looked wrong in ways that made my brain stutter. His skin wasn't just pale but translucent, blue veins mapping his face like rivers on a topographic map. Frost rimmed his nostrils and eyelashes, but the worst was his chest. A solid block of ice bulged from inside his rib cage, as if water had filled his lungs and frozen, expanding until his sternum cracked outward. Tiny crystalline structures caught the light, forming patterns too regular to be natural. Hexagons and spirals that reminded me of the frost on my mask. I leaned closer, fighting my revolting stomach, and saw something embedded in the ice. A small dark shape like a fishhook or... Kirill's eyes snapped open. I jerked backward so fast I fell on my ass, scrambling away on hands and heels like a crab. "What?" Kirill's mouth didn't move. His eyes, cloudy with ice crystals, stared straight ahead. But they were open. I swear to Christ they were closed when we found him. Semyon made a high keening sound, dropping his flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows. "Mary Mother of God," he whimpered in Russian. "The stories from Sector 2. They're true." Oleg, practical as always, approached Kirill's body with slow, deliberate movements. He pulled off a glove and reached toward Kirill's face. I wanted to scream at him not to touch it, but my mouth had gone desert dry. With surprising gentleness, Oleg closed Kirill's eyelids with his fingertips. Then he spat on the floor and made the sign of the cross backward, an old Russian gesture against evil. "We need to go," I croaked, finding my voice. "Now." We found a maintenance ladder bolted to the wall, rungs slick with condensation that burned cold against our bare hands. 23 rungs up. I counted each one, focusing on numbers instead of what we'd left behind. We hit a hatch sealed with frost. Oleg and I took turns hammering against it with our dive knives, the metal on metal clanging echoing down the shaft like church bells calling the dead. After what felt like an hour but was probably 3 minutes, the hatch popped open with the sound of ice cracking, showering us with frozen chips. A round, pockmarked face peered down, eyes wide as dinner plates behind smudged glasses. Malikov, the junior mechanic from Generator Room 3, who smuggled in chocolates from the supply flights and sold them for cigarettes. "Bozhe moi," he gasped, nearly dropping the wrench he held like a weapon. You came from down there?" His pimply throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. We hauled ourselves up into a dimly lit maintenance corridor near the medical wing. The sudden warmth made my frozen skin burn like it was being flayed with sandpaper. You need to report this." Semyon grabbed Malakov's sleeve. "The Watchers, they took Kirill. The mechanic wrenched away like Semyon was contagious. Niet, I saw nothing. I opened nothing." He backed away, boots squeaking on linoleum, then turned and ran, wrench still clutched to his chest. We didn't even make it 20 meters before a security team surrounded us. 6 men with batons drawn and dead eyes that had seen worse things than us. They didn't speak, just prodded us toward the detention block like cattle. They separated us into 3 cells that stank of bleach and piss and the particular sour smell fear leaves behind. My interrogation cell had a metal table bolted to the floor and a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord that swung slightly in currents we couldn't feel, creating shifting shadows that reminded me of things moving underwater. I sat there for 2 hours and 17 minutes. I counted every second, tapping my fingers against my thigh to keep myself sane, before the door banged open. Captain Voronin filled the frame, a vein pulsing in his temple like a trapped worm. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes were bloodshot and a muscle twitched in his jaw. He carried a metal lockbox under his arm, which he slammed onto the table so hard the legs shuddered. "Are you proud of yourself, Shevchenko?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. 3 men dead in a month wasn't enough for you? You needed to make it 4? My ears rang. Kirill wasn't my fault. You know what took him. The same thing that's been taking men for decades. Voronin's palm cracked across my face so fast I didn't see it coming. My head snapped sideways, copper flooding my mouth where my teeth had cut into my cheek. "You arrogant little insect," he hissed, leaning so close I could smell the pickled herring he'd had for lunch. "You think you've discovered some great secret? You know nothing. Nothing." I spat blood onto the floor between his polished boots. "I know the Watchers are real. I know they drink men's heat like vodka. I know you seal the hatches on your own divers when they see too much." Something flickered across Voronin's face. Not guilt, but something more complicated. He straightened, knuckles white around the lockbox. "The rule," he said slowly, deliberately, "exists for a reason. Our mission isn't just science, boy. It's survival." He unlocked the box with a key from around his neck. "The Watchers existed long before we came to this godforsaken lake. They'll be here long after we're gone." He reached into the box and pulled out a folder so old the Soviet Army stamp had faded to a pink smudge. In 1958, we lost an entire research team, 26 men. They reached something under the ice, something older than mankind. Since then, we've been paying the price. Sacrifices must be made. Sacrifices? I laughed, a sound like broken glass. Like my father? Like Mikhail? Like Kirill? The captain's eyes narrowed. Your father knew the risks, as did you when you signed your papers. He leaned in again, close enough that I could see a broken capillary in his right eye. I should have you shot for what you did, breaking into restricted areas, endangering the entire station, destroying equipment. Then do it, I snarled. Get it over with. I would, he said, with a coldness that left no doubt. Except we're 3 men short on dive rotation, and there's a situation in Valve Station 4. They threw me back in the cell, a 2x3 meter box of concrete with a metal shelf for a bed and a bucket for a toilet. The overhead light flickered at irregular intervals, making it impossible to sleep. I found myself counting the flickers, 3,217 before I heard boots stomping down the corridor. Guards tossed Oleg and Semyon into my cell. Oleg's left eye had swollen shut, and Semyon's fingers were bent at unnatural angles. We sat in silence, each trapped in our own private hells. The lock rattled an hour later. Berkutov slipped in, clutching a file labeled Top Secret. The red stamp across it was still wet enough to smear when he opened it. I bought you time, he whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Convinced the captain you might have value alive. Semyon laughed, a sound like tearing paper. As what? Lab rats? As test subjects, perhaps. Berkutov slid several yellowed pages across the floor to me, but also as our best chance. I scanned the documents, technical diagrams of something called a thermal disruption device, chemical formulas, observation notes dating back to 1962. One phrase jumped out. Subject remains undetected when emissions pattern oscillates between 32 to 34 degrees Celsius in irregular intervals. They've been studying them all along, I whispered. Not just studying, Berkutov grimaced, attempting to control, to weaponize, but the research stalled decades ago after incidents. So what's our value? Oleg growled, tenderly prodding his swollen eye. Valve Station 4 is failing. If it goes, the entire north wing floods with water at minus 40 degrees. 47 men dead in minutes. Let them drown, Semyon spat. Berkutov shook his head. You're missing the point. The valve station is in watcher territory. 3 repair teams have gone missing this year already. A siren wailed somewhere above us, its howl rising and falling like a wounded animal. Berkutov's head snapped up. That's the emergency alert, he hissed. Time's up. The cell door crashed open. Captain Voronin stood there, flanked by guards with rifles. His face was pale beneath his perpetual stubble, a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the chill. Congratulations, you worthless pieces of shit, he snarled. You've just become valuable. Valve Station 4 is critical. Fix it. You live another day. His lips peeled back from his teeth in something too vicious to be called a smile. Refuse, and I'll put a bullet in each of your heads myself. Oleg rose slowly, joints popping. We'll fix your damn valve, he said, voice deadly calm. But we want something in return. Voronin's eyebrow ticked upward. You're not in a position to negotiate. We are if you want to keep breathing air instead of water, Oleg countered. We dive with our own equipment, modified the way we want. We test the thermal disruptor patterns from those old files your command's been sitting on for 30 years. The captain's face twisted with rage. How did you... He cut himself off, eyes darting to Berkutov, who'd gone very still. Either we test our methods, I stepped in, or you can send another team to die. Your choice. Voronin's fists clenched and unclenched, a war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, he spat on the floor between us. One chance, he growled. One. Make it count. 2 guards marched us through corridors to the equipment bay, hands twitching on rifle triggers anytime we moved too quickly. Berkutov met us there, dark half-moons of exhaustion under his eyes, a cigarette burning forgotten between his yellow-stained fingers. Your miracle better work, Shevchenko, he muttered, flicking ash onto the concrete floor. Or they'll find all our bodies floating face down in the morning. He'd spent the night scrounging the equipment we needed. Heating coils torn from a decommissioned meteorological station, circuit boards stolen from radio units, a chemical compound that the lab boys had cooked up from industrial degreasers and ammonia. The bottle reeked so badly it made my eyes water from 3 meters away. A red-faced lab tech with glasses thick as bottle bottoms hovered nearby, wringing his hands. You're wasting your time, he kept saying, voice pitched high with nervousness. Malenkov tried thermal pulses in 74. They found his head wedged into a drainage pipe. Just his head. Shut your mouth, Petrovich, Berkutov snapped. Help them or get out. Valve Station 4 controlled the primary heat exchange for the North Quadrant. A complete failure meant 42 men frozen to death in their bunks within hours, another 30 potentially trapped when emergency bulkheads sealed automatically. The clock on the wall ticked like a bomb. 5:43 a.m. We slathered the chemical solution over our suits, the texture like congealed bacon grease, the stench so sharp it burned the inside of my nostrils. My gloved fingertips went numb where the compound soaked through the seams. Oleg's face contorted when he zipped his suit closed, the fabric sticking to his chest hair and ripping it out in patches. Shit fire, he hissed. Better than dying, but not by much. Semyon looked like a corpse already, his face the color of old wax, hands trembling so badly he kept dropping his regulator. I helped him secure it, pretending not to notice the wet tracks on his cheeks. "I can't go back down there," he whispered, just to me. "Not after Kirill. I can't." I gripped his shoulder. "The heaters will work. Just stay close." Voronin appeared as we headed to the dive platform, flanked by security men with dead eyes. He wore immaculate dress uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, putting on a show of authority for the nervous crew scrambling around us. 47 minutes, he said, tapping his watch. "After that, we evacuate the north wing and seal it permanently, with or without you inside." The platform descended with a metallic shriek that made my fillings hurt. Water closed over our heads like a black fist. The temperature gauge on my wrist dropped to -36°C, then kept falling until the needle jammed against the lower stop. The cold penetrated my suit almost immediately, needling into my flesh with icy fingers. The coil heater strapped to my chest activated with a vibration I felt in my sternum, pulsing heat for 2.7 seconds, then nothing for 4.1, then 1.8 seconds of heat, the irregular pattern we'd programmed to confuse the watchers. The relief when it heated was exquisite, almost sexual, making me gasp against my regulator. Valve Station 4 loomed ahead, our lights catching the metal structure embedded in the rock wall. Fluid sprayed from a jagged crack in the main housing, the water around it churning like a witch's cauldron. "Jesus," Oleg's voice crackled in my comm. "That's a Class 1 rupture." "Can we fix it?" I asked, fighting the instinct to turn tail and swim. "Maybe, if we're fast and lucky, and don't get eaten by those things." We approached cautiously, Oleg moving to the right flank, Semyon unspooling the replacement sleeve from his pack. The housing was cracked along a 3-foot seam, split by water pressure and what looked like deep gouges, claw marks, in the metal. Suddenly, Semyon gasped. "Movement! 3 o'clock, deep shadow." My beam swung right, catching a flash of pale movement. Something detached from the darkness, a figure that unfolded from a crevice in the rock like paper uncrinkling. It hung motionless for a moment, then began drifting toward us, moving with a fluid grace that felt obscene. "Keep working," I ordered, as more shapes emerged from the shadows. 6, no, 8 watchers now, their elongated bodies pale as fish bellies, limbs jointed in places human limbs shouldn't bend. They moved in perfect unison, like synchronized swimmers in hell's own pool. Oleg clamped the sleeve around the valve while Semyon began the complex process of sealing it. I kept my light trained on the approaching watchers, counting the seconds between heat pulses from my coil. One watcher, taller than the others, its head shaped like a teardrop, broke from the group and glided directly toward me. I could see details now I'd missed before, the translucent quality of its skin showing ghostly shadows of internal structures that weren't organs, the webbing between its 2 long fingers, the faint pattern of ridges where a human would have a face, like ripples in sand after tide has gone out. It extended one hand, 7 fingers splayed wide. I froze, unable to look away from the hollow where eyes should be. The water around me suddenly felt thick, resistant, as if I were suspended in honey instead of liquid. A nauseating pressure built behind my eyes, and my ears popped painfully. Then my heating coil pulsed, sending a wave of 38-degree heat through my chest. The watcher reacted instantly, its body convulsed as if electrocuted, elongated limbs contracting. It retreated 3 meters in a single fluid movement. "It works," I shouted, hope surging so strongly my voice broke. The heat pulses repel them. Beside me, Semyon had 2 watchers circling him, but they maintained distance, recoiling whenever his heater cycled on. "They hate it," he confirmed, voice steadier than I'd heard since we found Kirill. "Like throwing salt on slugs." Oleg grunted, hammering the final clamp into place. Seals holding. Valve pressure normalizing. His broad back hunched as he worked, the watchers hovering just beyond the range of his heat pulses. We'd done it. The valve was fixed. "Let's get the hell out of here," Oleg said, signaling for assent. That's when I realized the watchers had arranged themselves in a circle around us. Not attacking, not retreating, waiting. The hairs on my neck stood up despite the cold. This was coordinated behavior. Intelligent. We kicked upward, huddled in a tight triangle for protection. My relief evaporated when I looked up. Pressed against the underside of the ice was the largest watcher I'd ever seen. Its body stretched at least 15 feet from end to end, limbs splayed out like a spindly starfish. The ice around it had frosted in complex geometric patterns, perfect hexagons and spirals rippling outward as if the creature were somehow drawing energy from the frozen surface itself. "Holy Mother of God," Semyon choked, panic rising in his voice. My oxygen alarm shrieked, the needle dropping from 65% to 32% in seconds. Semyon clutched his throat. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "It's drinking us dry." The creature above us pulsed, its body contracting and expanding like a translucent heart. Each pulse corresponded to another drop in my oxygen levels: 29%, 24%, 18%. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. My lungs felt like they were filling with cement. In desperation, I fumbled for the emergency chemical canister strapped to my belt, my numbed fingers clumsy as sausages. I found the release pin, yanked it free, and hurled the canister upward. It hit the ice near the giant watcher and burst, releasing a cloud of milk-white solution. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. Its entire body convulsed as if in agony, limbs thrashing against the ice. The frost patterns shattered like breaking glass. The giant watcher contracted, then expanded, then slid sideways, moving away from the chemical cloud, creating an opening directly beneath the dive hatch. We didn't hesitate. We kicked upward with the last of our strength, Oleg dragging Semyon, whose movements had grown sluggish. My vision tunneled, darkness encroaching from all sides as my oxygen hit single digits. Then light, blessed light, as the hatch opened above us. Hands grabbed my shoulders, holding me upward with bruising force. I broke the surface, gasping like a drowning man, lungs heaving as if they could never get enough air. "Get them out! Now!" someone shouted. I collapsed onto the platform in a puddle of freezing water, fingers clawing at my mask. Ice had formed over the entire visor in the pattern of a face. Not my face, but something with hollowed eyes and a gash-like mouth that seemed to be screaming. I scraped it away frantically, the chunks shattering on the deck with audible pops like breaking bones. Semyon lay beside me, lips blue-tinged, eyes rolled back showing whites streaked with burst blood vessels. Oleg was on his hands and knees, coughing up lake water tinted pink with blood. But we were alive. All of us. Crewmen swarmed the platform, medical orderlies pushing through with stretchers and thermal blankets. Someone jabbed a needle into my arm, warm relief flooding my veins, pushing back the killing cold. I was lifted, carried through corridors that tilted and spun as the sedative took hold. Snippets of consciousness, white ceiling tiles with brown water stains, the antiseptic smell of the infirmary, the burning pain of thawing extremities, Novikov's nicotine-stained fingers checking my pulse, severe hypothermia, blood oxygen critical, peripheral frostbite. Hours later, or maybe days, I couldn't tell, Voronin appeared at my bedside, his face a carefully neutral mask. 2 security men flanked him, hands resting on holstered pistols. "The valve is operational," he said without preamble. North wing pressure stabilized. My throat felt scoured with sandpaper. The repulsion method works. Something that might have been respect flickered in his cold eyes. Yes, the thermal variability appears to confuse their senses. The chemical compound causes them actual distress. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. If High Command learned we'd discovered a defense against the Watchers, there would be questions, investigations, things neither of us wants. Of course, it always came down to covering asses, burying secrets, even when those secrets could save lives. The station has oxygen for 3 more months, Voronin continued. You've bought us time. This buys you continued existence. Not freedom, not safety, just permission to keep breathing. He left without waiting for a response. I lay back, exhaustion pulling me toward sleep, when I noticed something odd. My oxygen tank leaned against the wall, valve closed, gauges disconnected, yet the needle was moving, dropping slowly but steadily as I watched. A chill that had nothing to do with hypothermia crawled up my spine. I remembered the giant watcher, how it had moved aside instead of attacking, how it had looked at me. No, into me, through me, with those hollow non-eyes. I closed my eyes, but couldn't escape the certainty growing in my gut. That thing hadn't been repelled by my chemical canister. It had recognized me somehow, let me pass, maybe even chosen me. For what, I couldn't begin to imagine, and that thought terrified me more than drowning in the black waters ever could. The station lurched back into its routines like a man with a broken leg insisting he could still walk. Morning bell at 0500, breakfast slop at 0530, duty rotations posted by 0600. No one mentioned Kirill's name, not once. His bunk was stripped and reassigned to a new technician within 48 hours. In the logs, his death was recorded as equipment failure during standard maintenance procedure. The only acknowledgement of his existence was a half-empty vodka bottle passed silently around the mess hall one night, each man taking a single swig before passing it on. Semyon cracked like glass hit with a hammer. He developed a twitching tic in his left eyelid, flinched at sudden movements, and jumped when anyone touched him unexpectedly. He refused diving assignments with such violent panic attacks, they finally reassigned him to radio duty. I'd catch him in the comm room, headset off, staring at the static patterns on the oscilloscope screen for hours, his fingernails chewed to bloody bits. Oleg retreated into a grim stoicism, drinking more than before but never enough to impair his work. His stubble grew into a patchy beard that collected ice crystals when he exhaled in the cold corridors. Each time he suited up for a dive, he'd make the sign of the cross, backward, the way superstitious sailors do to ward off evil, when he thought no one was looking. Berkutov passed me in the corridors with the furtive glances of a man who'd shared a terrible secret. Once he pressed a folded paper into my palm during inspection, latitude and longitude coordinates that matched nothing on any map I could find. I went through the motions like a wind-up toy, my routines as mechanical as the pumps that kept the station from flooding. But inside my head, things had changed. A constant pressure sat behind my right eye, throbbing in time with my heartbeat. I'd wake at 0317 every single night, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled wrong, metallic like old pennies. Twice I woke to find frost patterns on my ceiling that resembled elongated handprints. The whispers started 7 days after our encounter with the giant watcher. At first, just background noise I couldn't quite make out, like a radio tuned between stations. Then clearer, my name in a voice that sounded like bubbles rising through thick liquid. I'd spin around to find empty hallways, vacant chairs. The dreams were worse. That massive shape pressed against ice, watching me with hollows where eyes should be. Elongated fingers beckoning, but not threateningly. Almost welcomingly. I'd wake with the taste of lake water in my mouth, my pillow damp as if I'd been drooling black fluid in my sleep. 19 days after the valve station incident, I dug my father's knife from the bottom of my footlocker, where I'd hidden it under spare socks and letters from my mother. I never answered. The blade had developed a patina like bruised skin, and the bone handle felt warm to the touch despite the perpetual cold of the station. My father had carved his initials into the butt, KIS, now worn smooth from years of handling. I ran my thumb over the nick near the hilt, remembering a summer day on Lake Baikal when I was 7, him showing me how to split a fish from tail to gills in one clean stroke. Sharp blade, clean hands, clear conscience, he'd say, though the last part made no sense to me at the time. What would he think of me now? The boy who'd followed his ghost to this frozen hell? When he disappeared, my mother told me he'd died on a classified mission for the state. A hero. I'd believed her until I found a box of his papers in the attic, letters from an Arctic research station, photos of him scuba diving under ice, notes scribbled in the margins of technical manuals. They're down there, watching, waiting. And now here I was, 13 years later, 3,000 kilometers from home, with blood on my hands from men who'd trusted me. Mikhail's novel would never be finished. Kirill would never see his little sisters again. All because I'd been obsessed with a father who'd chased monsters until they swallowed him whole. On my last day at the station, a storm howled outside like animals being tortured, flinging ice particles against the windows with such force they left pockmarks in the glass. The thermal system struggled to keep up, leaving the canteen so cold you could see your breath. I sat in the corner farthest from the door, nursing a metal cup of tea that had gone cold before I'd taken a single sip, the surface skinned over with a film like dirty oil. Oleg's tray clattered down opposite mine, his portion of gray stew steaming in the frigid air. His knuckles were split and crusted with dried blood that flaked onto his bread as he tore it in half. "Shipping out tomorrow?" he asked, shoving stew into his mouth with mechanical efficiency, never looking up from his tray. I nodded, poking at my own congealed food. "So they tell me." "You did good with those heaters," he said after swallowing, a chunk of gristle caught in his yellowed teeth. "Saved our sorry asses." From Oleg, this was practically a tearful farewell speech. A laugh escaped me, sounding more like something breaking than actual humor. If only command gave half a crap about keeping men alive as they do about keeping secrets buried. "That's the Soviet Navy for you," Oleg grunted, mopping gravy with black bread. "They'll spend 5,000 rubles designing a better torpedo and 5 kopecks on the men who have to fire it." A shadow fell across our table. Private Konev, a twitchy kid with acne scars and uneven haircut, stood there looking like he was about to wet himself. "Shevchenko," he stammered, Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing float. "Captain wants you. Now." He scurried away before I could even respond. Voronin's office sat at the end of officers' corridor, distinguished from other rooms only by a dented metal plaque with his name and rank, the letters filled with grime. I knocked twice, heard his barked enter, and stepped into a space that smelled of cigarettes, boot polish, and the peculiar tang of fear that seems to permeate any room where military discipline is administered. The captain stood behind his metal desk precisely at parade rest, as if someone had stuck a rod up his ass and welded it to his spine. Behind him, the small window rattled in its frame, the glass vibrating in rhythm with the storm outside. A row of medals gleamed on his chest, awards for missions that probably didn't officially exist. His desk held exactly 3 items: a blotter with no paper on it, a steel pen that lay at precisely 45 degrees to the desk edge, and a framed photo turned away from visitors, showing only the back of a cheap wooden frame. "Transfer orders," he said without preamble, eyes drilling into mine. "You leave at 0600. My heart stuttered, then raced. "Transfer? To where?" The corner of Voronin's mouth twitched, not a smile, more like a facial spasm. "Special Research Facility B12, classified location, classified mission parameters." My mouth went bone dry. "Sir, High Command specifically requested you," he continued, cutting me off. "Seems your particular experiences have made you valuable." The word valuable slithered from his mouth like something venomous. I thought of my father, another valuable man who disappeared on a classified mission. And if I refuse? Voronin's laugh was a single bark, sharp as a gunshot. "This isn't a negotiation, specialist. It's an order." He leaned forward, knuckles pressing into the metal desktop hard enough to whiten. "You will forget what you saw beneath the ice. You will forget your little theories about your father. You will do your duty to the state, as all of us must." His contempt was so thick I could almost taste it, bitter as burnt coffee grounds. He straightened, adjusted his uniform jacket with a sharp tug. That will be all. Dismissed. I stumbled into the corridor, legs rubbery beneath me. Oleg waited against the opposite wall, arms folded, eyes narrowed to slits. "Transfer?" he asked, voice pitched low. I nodded, unable to force words past the knot in my throat. "Listen to me," Oleg hissed, grabbing my arm and dragging me into a maintenance alcove where the surveillance mic had been accidentally damaged weeks ago. His breath smelled of onions and tobacco as he leaned close. Men who get transferred from here don't write letters home. They don't take vacations. They don't retire to Black Sea dachas. His fingers dug into my bicep, leaving bruises I'd find later. They disappear, like your father. I stalked the midnight corridors, feet dragging on concrete still wet from the evening mop down, my shadow stretching and shrinking under each buzzing fluorescent panel. Sleep wasn't just impossible. It felt dangerous. Each time I closed my eyes, those hollow eye sockets waited behind my lids. My transfer papers sat folded in my breast pocket, the edges already fraying from how many times I'd pulled them out, read them, cursed them, and shoved them back. 3 cigarettes and a half bottle of medicinal alcohol stolen from Dr. Novikov's cabinet hadn't dulled the panic clawing up my throat. I found myself picking at the skin around my thumbnail until it bled, watching the tiny red droplets bead up and freeze on my fingertip in the sub-zero corridor. My boots carried me toward the main diving bay like they had a mind of their own. The steel door hissed open on hydraulics that needed oiling, the screech echoing in the cavernous chamber. 2 halogen lamps cast pools of sickly yellow light across the dive platform. Below it, black water lapped against metal with soft, wet kissing sounds. I stared at the sealed metal hatch in the platform, locked with a red wheel valve and 3 separate padlocks, flimsy barriers between us and them. Rule number 7 glared from a stenciled warning above the platform. Our mission always comes first. Someone had scratched a tiny addition beneath it, even if it kills us all. A gust of air colder than the already frigid room prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. Behind me, the hydraulic door wheezed open. I spun around, hand reaching instinctively for the diving knife strapped to my belt. Nobody there. Just a draft from the ventilation system sending paper scraps skittering across cement. The overhead lights flickered 3 times in rapid succession, the electrical system hiccuping as the generators battled the storm outside. During the millisecond of darkness between flickers, something moved at the far end of the bay, a vertical slash of deeper darkness that shouldn't exist. When the light steadied, the corridor stood empty. "Damn it," I whispered, my voice swallowed by the immensity of the chamber. The word came out as a white puff that froze instantly and fell to the floor as tiny ice crystals. My hands trembled as I fumbled a flashlight from my pocket. The beam swept the corridor, catching nothing but chipped green paint and exposed pipes dripping condensation. I took 3 careful steps forward, muscles coiled tight as watch springs. 10 meters down the corridor, a puddle glistened on the concrete. Not the usual brown slush from men's boots, but clear water that caught my flashlight beam and reflected it with mirror-like perfection. The surface rippled without any breeze to disturb it. I crouched beside it, knees popping in the silence. The puddle measured maybe 15 centimeters across, perfectly circular. When I dipped my fingertip in, the cold that shot up my arm wasn't just freezing, it was active, aggressive, like it wanted to burrow into my bones. I snatched my hand back with a hiss. Where the water had touched my skin, a white patch of instant frostbite bloomed, dead skin already peeling back from red flesh. "God help me," I muttered, scrambling backward on hands and heels. A thought hit me like a bucket of ice water. They weren't just following me. They were hunting me. In the infirmary last week, I'd watched my disconnected oxygen tank's needle drop from 70% to 43% in the span of a 10-minute conversation. The doctors blamed gauge malfunction. They hadn't seen the frost patterns forming on the glass. tiny whirls and spirals that perfectly matched those we'd seen under the ice. I bolted for the door, dignity forgotten. The transfer papers crackled in my pocket, my ticket out of this frozen hell. But as the corridor lights flickered again, I caught my own reflection in a pipe's chrome surface, just for an instant, and the face looking back wasn't mine. The eyes were hollow, black pits, the mouth stretched too wide. I couldn't outrun what was already inside me. They came for me at 0430. 2 guards with red-rimmed eyes and Makarov pistols strapped to their hips, neither one meeting my gaze as they stood in my doorway. No time for breakfast. No chance to say proper goodbyes. "Just get your stuff, 5 minutes," barked through a cloud of cigarette breath. I stuffed my meager belongings into the same canvas duffel I'd brought 3 months earlier, now stained with grease and stinking of industrial soap. My father's knife I wrapped in a spare sock and tucked inside my boot, not trusting the guards or anyone else with it. The blade had grown colder lately, almost burning to touch, like metal left in deep freeze. The loading dock thermometer read -43 as we stepped outside into knife-edge wind. The same battered ZIL 131 truck waited, engine grumbling and belching blue-black diesel smoke that the wind shredded into ribbons. The same driver, too, Stepanovich with his walrus mustache frosted white at the edges, his bloodshot eyes fixed straight ahead, never acknowledging my existence. Oleg stood at the door to equipment bay 2, arms crossed over his barrel chest, face impassive except for a muscle jumping in his left cheek. 3 meters to his right, Semyon huddled in his too big coat, shoulders hunched, fingers constantly moving, counting invisible beads maybe, or working through some mathematical formula that might explain away the horrors we'd seen. Berkutov lingered in the shadow of a doorway, not officially there, just happening to smoke his morning cigarette as I climbed into the truck bed. No salutes, no handshakes, just 3 men watching a 4th being shipped to whatever came next. The station shrank behind us, concrete bunkers half buried in snow like the crooked teeth of some massive creature frozen mid-bite. Above them, the lake stretched impossibly white, morning sun catching crystals that sparkled like broken glass. Somewhere beneath that white expanse, they watched, waited. I knew it like I knew my own heartbeat. The truck's wheels crunched through ice crust, sending jolts up my spine as I sat on the metal bench bolted to the truck bed. My single duffel bag slid back and forth with each bump, scraping against corrugated steel. The 2 guards sat opposite, AK-47s across their knees, breath pluming white between chapped lips. Neither spoke. Neither looked at me directly. 4 hours and 36 minutes of bone-rattling progress through a landscape bleached of color. Snowfields stretching to a horizon so distant it curved. Skeletal birch trees clustered in patches like old men huddled against cold. Once, a lone wolf watched us pass, yellow eyes tracking our movement before melting back into white. We reached the airstrip, a strip of packed snow with 3 rusted windsocks and a single Quonset hut. A massive Antonov, and 12 waited, propellers already spinning, its bulbous nose and squat body making it look like some prehistoric insect. Frost coated its wings in delicate fern patterns that reminded me of the markings on Kirill's frozen chest. As I climbed down from the truck, my oxygen tank, the emergency one I'd insisted on keeping with me, suddenly felt wrong. Heavier, colder. I glanced at the pressure gauge and watched the needle drop from 82% to 71% in the time it took to blink. My stomach clenched, acid burning my throat. "Move it," barked the guard, shoving me toward the plane with a gloved hand. I stood rooted, legs like concrete pillars, as the needle dropped again. 62%, 54%, 48%. My breath came in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the thin air. The watchers had found me, even here, kilometers from the lake. I could almost feel them. That pressure behind my eyes, that crawling sensation at the base of my skull, like fingers probing inside my head. "Did you hear me?" The guard grabbed my arm, his voice rising. I said, "I heard you," I whispered. A sound caught my ear. My name, stretched into unnatural syllables, carried on wind that suddenly smelled of lake bottom and rotting things. Lev. It sounded like my father's voice, but wrong, like someone wearing his vocal cords without understanding how they worked. The same inflection he'd use when calling me in for dinner, but slowed down, stretched out, turned into something obscene. My legs finally moved, carrying me toward the aircraft's gaping cargo bay. The ramp felt wrong beneath my boots, not metal, but something softer, giving slightly with each step, like walking on flesh turned almost but not quite solid. Inside, cargo straps dangled like viscera from the ceiling. 4 other men, technicians or prisoners I couldn't tell, sat strapped to bench seats along the walls, faces carved from tallow, eyes fixed on nothing. The loadmaster secured me with straps that crossed my chest like surgical restraints, then moved away without a word. The engines screamed higher as we taxied, vibration rattling my teeth in their sockets. My oxygen tank sat between my knees, gauge now reading 23%. The metal surface had frosted over, patterns swirling and connecting, forming shapes that almost resembled letters in some alien alphabet. I stared at my father's knife, half pulled from my boot. The blade caught the dim cargo bay light, reflecting not my face but something else. A silhouette, elongated and wrong, watching me from polished steel. We were airborne, climbing steeply away from the ice field, the station, the lake. But as the needle on my tank dropped to 9%, I knew with bone-deep certainty, distance meant nothing. Whatever marked me, whatever chose me, was coming along for the ride. The other passengers nodded off or stared blankly into middle distance, military men accustomed to being shipped from one frozen hellhole to another. None of them felt the cold spot spreading between my shoulder blades. None of them heard the whispers that seemed to come from the oxygen tank itself, a sucking, rattling breath like someone drowning in air. I curled my fingers around my father's knife handle, the worn bone grip warm against my palm when everything else felt like death. Whatever waited for me at the next station, whatever had followed my father into darkness, I would face it with eyes open. Not that I had any choice. The watchers had already made sure of that. I closed my eyes and surrendered to exhaustion, uncertain whether it was sleep or something deeper pulling me under. Somewhere, beneath the ice in Siberia, the watchers still waited with their elongated limbs and hollow faces, and I suspect that no matter where I go, one day they'll return for me, silently, inevitably, like the hush of a frozen lake at midnight. I can't tell you what happened after that flight. Orders were classified. Perhaps they transferred me to another research facility, perhaps a labor camp, perhaps a grave no one will ever find. What I know is that the watchers are real, and they don't confine themselves to water. They linger in your mind, in your fear, in the spaces between what's known and what can never be understood. So I leave you with this warning. If you ever see a silhouette on the ice that you can't explain, don't speak to it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't even blink. The moment you do, you let the watchers in. And once they've found you, they never really leave. That's the end of this story. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It would help me out more than you can imagine. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.